Okay, good evening everyone and welcome. I'm just going to I've posted the link to the handout. For those that didn't manage to get the link to the handout, if you click on the link I just posted in the chat, and also for those watching on YouTube later, I'll put it in the description so you can follow inside. So good evening everyone, thank you for joining. Thank you. So I wanted to look at the famous sequence of psukim, which describe the descent of Yaakov and his family to Mitzrayim, and the question that taxes the minds of Chazal already in the various Midrashim and the Rishonim, the commentaries, as to the discrepancy in the number count. So just very briefly look at the psukim, and once we've seen the psukim, I'm going to try and share the perspective of different Rishonim on the matter. We'll see again how so often when there's a machlokas between the Rishonim, that means the commentaries take a different stance as to how to resolve the psukim. What's really going on is they have a different understanding of what the text is. How should Torah be learned? What is Peshat? What is a reasonable reading of the psukim? And as I've said again and again in this series of shiurim, the assumptions we bring to the text, what sort of text we think it is, determines what's considered a reasonable reading of the psukim. You read a technical manual differently to the way one would read a piece of poetry, to a piece of Shakespeare, and similarly VaYigash very differently. How one reads Torah will depend on how one understands what the nature of Pshat and how it works. So on page 1 of the handouts, I've really just printed a summary of the list of names, the genealogy of Yaakov and his descendants who descend to Egypt. I cut out some of the psukim and just tried to put in the main ones that we need to see. So the Torah starts off by listing those who descended to Egypt with Yaakov, and it starts off by listing the children of Leah, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, and Zevulun, and their children. And then it says these are the sons of Leah, Pasuk Tesvav, the middle of the handout. Again, those don't have it, I'll just post the link. Pasuk Tesvav, Pasuk 15. Eile b'nei Leah, asher yolda Yaakov padan aram, v'estina b'toi. So these are the children, the sons of Leah, along with Dinah, Yaakov's daughter. Kol nefesh banav v'benosov, the sum totality of his sons and daughters, shloshim v'sholosh, are 33. Now, a simple count of the names mentioned only comes to 32, and this is the first problem. The Pasuk says the totality of names mentioned is 33, but in fact there are only 32. A reflection of this problem is in the closing sequence of the genealogy, Pasuk Kafvav and Kasayin, 26 and 27. So let's look at those. Kol hanefesh haba Yaakov Mitzrayma, all the souls that belonged to Yaakov who came down to Egypt, Yotzi Yerecho, those who came out of his loins, Milvad Neshei b'nei Yaakov, excluding the spouses, the wives of his children, Kol Nefesh Shishim V'Sheish, all the souls are 66. Or b'nei Yosef, now this is correct mathematically. If you add up the names all mentioned, that is indeed the correct number. Or b'nei Yosef asher yolad lo b'Mitzrayim, now add in the children of Yosef who were born to Yaakov in Mitzrayim, Nefesh Shnayim, that's a further 2 souls, along with Yosef, that's an additional soul. So we now have 66 plus 3, 69. And then again, the same problem in the Pasuk. Kol HaNefesh LeBeis Yaakov Haba Mitzrayim, all the souls of the Beis Yaakov who came down to Egypt, Shivim, are 70. So we have the same mathematical problem occurring twice. Once in the list of the names of the children of Leah, there are 32 names listed, but the Pasuk calls them 33. And then at the end of the 70 count, it correctly adds up the names and says these are 66, plus 3 existing souls in Egypt, 69, and yet the Pasuk calls number count 70. So this is the difficulty in the psukim. Now, the most familiar, most famous answer to this question is the one that's presented by Rashi for obvious reasons, because Rashi has become so dominant as a Mefurish that we are all familiar with what Rashi says. Says Rashi, Shloshim Shalosh, 33, or Biprotom, but when you break them down into the numbers, Yatamotzi Ela Shloshim Shtaim. So this is the bottom of page 1 in the handout. When you actually look at the numbers, there's only 32. So how can the pasuk say they're 33? Elozu Yocheved. This is Yocheved. Shenolda bein hachomos, who was born between the chamot, between the walls, the knisosim as they entered Egypt. Shenema sheyolda usa lelevi b'mitzrayim. Because later, where's later in Sefer Shemos, when we revisit, of course, Yocheved, who is now a very important character as the wife of Amram and the mother of Moshe, and an important obvious person in her own right. She is described as Asher Yolda Osa LeLevi b'Mitzrayim, as having been born to Levi in Egypt. Leidosa b'Mitzrayim. So Rashi picks up on a nuance of language, very interesting. Leidosa b'Mitzrayim, her birth was in Egypt. Ve'ein horosa b'Mitzrayim, but her pregnancy or her conception was not in Egypt, indicating that she was born between the walls. She was sort of somewhat created in Eretz Yisrael and somewhat brought into the world in Egypt. She's born between the walls. So this is Rashi's answer to the question. Now, there's several things that we need to think about in this explanation. First of all, we need to think through what the implications of this are for Peshat. And we'll see that the Bali Peshat, some of them are horrified by Rashi's explanation, because of the implications of how this works out, and the fact that it's not really mentioned in the Psukim. So what are the implications in terms of Pshat? That's our first question that we need to understand. Secondly, what's going on over here? I mean, why would this remarkable coincidence occur that Yocheved is born just between the walls? Is it just how things happen to work out, or is there significance in that? And actually what's going on in this whole count of the descendants of Yaakov and the genealogy of Yaakov, and the fact that the numbers are just below 70 and then hit 70 through the birth of Yocheved. So what are we meant to make of this? So our next step is going to be to look at the questions on Rashi, and these are vigorously and strongly presented by the Ibn Ezra. So Ibn Ezra is Ibn Ezra from a very different part of the world to Rashi. He's a Spanish, originating from Spain. He's a Baal Peshat, like Rashi. He tries to seek the simplest reading, the Peshat reading in the Psukim, but avoids generally Midrashim in so doing. And as far as we know, the Ibn Ezra did know of Rashi's commentary, but rarely chose to mention it explicitly, but often picks a fight with Rashi's Peshat. Ibn Ezra had a very, very difficult and interesting and fascinating life, but due to the difficult conditions of his life, he ended up traveling across the world, the Jewish world of Europe at the time, and was a very important figure in bringing Torah from different parts of the world. And as far as we understand, definitely encountered the Beit Midrash of Rashi and Rashi's descendants, the Bali Tosfos, and had some interactions with them. So let's see what the Ibn Ezra says. Yesh Omer, there are those who say, Ki mispa shivim, that the number 70, but avorsha hu sach cheshbon, it's because it's a rounding up of a number. Ki shishim v'teisha hayu, because in truth they were 69, and therefore this is a rounding up of the numbers. Now, who is it who says this Peshat, that the 69 is round up to 70, which is ostensibly a reasonable explanation, right? The rounds up, we all round up numbers in life, and therefore when the Torah says that there was 70 that went down to Egypt, what it really means to say is there was 69 and it's rounded up to 70. Who says this Peshat? So it's very interesting, no less a figure than Maimon, the father of the Rambam. How do we know this? Because we're privileged in really in our lifetime for the Perush of the Rabbi Zobin ben Rambam, the son of the Rambam, to come to light. And he quotes various Peshatim from himself, but also from his father and his grandfather. And he quotes his Peshat from his grandfather, Rabbeinu Maimon. So we have learned a little bit of Torah, not just from, in our lives now, not just from the Rambam, but even from Rabbeinu Maimon, the father of the Rambam. So this is the source of this Peshat. But what do we think about this Peshat? Does it work? This is a good Peshat? It doesn't work with 33, yeah. So Ibn Ezra raises it. This is a terrible problem on the Peshat. If we only had, you didn't like the Peshat because you don't like the idea of rounding it up, it's imprecise, or? Why not be accurate? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like 10,000.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. So it's difficult to understand the concept of rounding up with these low numbers, but maybe we're familiar with the idea of rounding up and down, as you said, when it comes to thousands. So I don't think anyone will have a difficulty in Peshat when we're looking at 600,000 Yotzei Mitzrayim and look at the numbers, each tribe 22,000, and you understand it's round up or down by the Torah by a handful of numbers. That's reasonable. But it's a little harder when it comes to 70. But the Ibn Ezra has a knockout blow in this Peshat. He says it's not just rounding up when it comes to 70, it's also changing 32 to 33. So this doesn't work because 33 is no more of a round number than 32. So we know where the rounding up occurs. It's true that when you look at the ends, we have 69, which somehow becomes 70. But when we look at the beginning, the B'nai Leah, we have 32, which somehow becomes 33. So this is a pella. I mean, this is a knockout blow. I don't know how Rabbeinu Maimon would have answered this question. So let's see. It says, this commentator made a mistake because we find that the list of the sons of Leah are 33, and in truth, they are only 32. Fine. So that's explanation number one. Then he says, Midrash, there's a Midrashic explanation. Yocheved was born between the walls. And he says, I don't understand this either. Gamzer Toma, he says this is also very difficult. Why didn't the Pasuk tell us the miracle that was done with her? Because in that case, she gave birth to Moshe when she was 130 years old. The maths is very simple. The Yetzias Mitzrayim happened 210 years after Yaakov descended to Egypt. Moshe was 80 at Yetzias Mitzrayim, which means he was born 130 years after the descent down to Egypt. If Yocheved was born as they entered Egypt, Yocheved was 130 years old. This is an incredible miracle, right? Think about what a fuss the Torah makes about Avram and Sarah giving birth at 190 respectively, 190. So Yocheved giving birth at 130. This is a remarkable miracle. And then he carries on in a typical Ibn Ezra's twist of language. Our pain isn't sufficient for us, but the Paitanim have made this even worse. And now he quotes a piyut that was sung on Simchas Torah, in which it describes very movingly and emotionally Yocheved being present at the scene of Moshe's death and the pain she feels as a mother seeing her son Moshe dying. If we do the maths at this point, she's now 250 years old at the time of Moshe's death. Moshe lives 120 years. She gives birth to Moshe when she's 130, so she's 250 years old. That again is an extraordinary old age. We would have expected it to be mentioned in the Torah. We wouldn't expect this to have been kept silent. So Ibn Ezra isn't willing to go with this Peshat, and he says the correct answer, in my opinion, is Yaakov b'cheshbon. Yaakov counts in the number, and the whole count begins from him. And therefore, when it says that there's 33, it means 32 descendants of Yaakov plus Yaakov. When it says there's 70, it means 69 descendants plus Yaakov, and that's how we get to the 70. This is the Ibn Ezra's Peshat in the Psukim. Now, how good or difficult is reading in the Psukim is this? So there's also an imprecision that one has to accept in this Peshat, because the Pasuk says Kol nefesh bonov u'benosov shloshim v'shalosh. The number of the sons and daughters of Yaakov is 33, and what it really means to say is Kol nefesh bonov u'benosov plus Yaakov, because it's only 33, including Yaakov himself. Says the Ibn Ezra, this is something familiar that we find in the language of the Torah, and indeed in regular speech, that if you're talking about a mass of people, you might group them all together, even though there's one exception who doesn't quite fit that description. And when it says these are the names of the descendants of Yaakov, all the descendants of Yaakov are 33, it means alongside Yaakov. He points out, by the way, that you have to say something like this in the final pasuk of this count of 70. Because the pasuk in the final count of 70 says there's 66 who came down to Egypt, plus Yosef and his two sons who were already there. Kol nefesh b'beis Yaakov haba mitzrayma, the number of souls who came down to Egypt, shivim are 70. Now there's no 70 who go down to Egypt, because there's 3 who are already in Egypt. So how do we explain the pasukim? It must mean that there's 70 who come down to Egypt. Most of the 70 are coming down to Egypt, but there's 3 who are already there. So it's a style or a turn of phrase which says all those who came down to Egypt are 70. What it really means is the vast majority, 95% of those who came down to Egypt, of the 70 came down to Egypt. There's the odd exception who was already there. Similarly, it's legitimate to say that Nefesh Yaakov includes Yaakov himself. And by the way, in the final pasuk, this reads very well. Kol Nefesh lebeis Yaakov, all the souls in the house of Yaakov. Yaakov is also a member of his household, and therefore this is a reasonable and legitimate reading of the psukim according to the Ibn Ezra. So this is a second way of reading the psukim. He says that this is a miracle too far. I don't go for this, that Yocheved was born between the Chomas, because when you do the maths, it comes out with this incongruous result in which Yocheved was 130 when she gave birth to Moshe. That would be a miracle that we'd expect to be mentioned in the Torah. Now, there is a very, very important Ramban on this Ibn Ezra, and I'd like us to spend a little bit of time looking at the Ramban. I printed the Ramban at full length. We're not going to go through it inside at full length just because of time, but I printed it at full length so that people can have a look at it afterwards, because this is really one of the very classic Rambans, and this definitely brings out the degree to which one's assumptions about the theology of the Torah and how the world works affects what one considers to be reasonable pshat in the psukim. So the Ramban starts off with quoting the answer that Yocheved is born bein hachomos. He then brings Rabbi Avram's critique of this. Rabbi Avram is Rabbi Avram ibn Ezra, and he brings Rabbi Avram's critique on this in the first paragraph of the printed Ramban. We won't look at any of that inside. He then opens the second paragraph in the printed Ramban. Again, I'll see some more people are trying. For those of you who don't have it, I'll just place the handout on that. In the second paragraph of the Ramban, he says the following line: "V'hinei penyer chochom be'enov b'stiras divrei Rabbi Tzveinu, lest he, the Ibn Ezra, be a wise person in his eyes to contradicting the words of our teachers. Ani tzorich la'anos elav, I need to answer him." So he says, I can't leave the Ibn Ezra's accusations and attacks against this Pshat unanswered. I don't want him thinking he's cleverer than Chazal. Because don't forget, the Ibn Ezra is not picking a fight here with Rashi, ultimately. He's picking a fight with Chazal. Because this explanation is based on the words of a Gemara in Sota and in various other places. It's Rashi quoting Midrash and quoting Chazal. And therefore the Ramban says, I need to respond to the Ibn Ezra's attack on Chazal, and we need to come up with an answer. And here the Ramban says something very, very profound and important. And he really unpicks the Ibn Ezra stage by stage. And the first thing is, he says, I don't know what the Ibn Ezra wants. Okay, let's ignore Chazal for a few moments, and let's consider that Yocheved was born when? Well, she's not listed in the 70 souls who went down to Egypt. She's listed sometime later. He says we still have the same fundamental problem with the numbers, which is that they are 210 years in Egypt, and Yocheved is the mother of Moshe, and Moshe is 80 years old, as the Pasuk tells us, when he stood in front of Paro. So Moshe is born 130 years after the entry into Egypt. So he says, when was Yocheved born? Well, if she's born as they enter Egypt, as Chazal say, then indeed she's 130 when Moshe is born. Very remarkable. Okay, so let's split the difference. Let's say she's born 50 years after they enter into Egypt. Well, she's still 90 when Moshe is born. Well, let's go even further. Let's say she's born 100 years after they enter Egypt. Great. So she's only 30 when Moshe is born. But then how old is Levi? Well, Levi's already dead by this point. So did Levi give birth to Yocheved right at the end of his life as a very old man? He says, let's do the calculations. He works out for us the math, the Ramban. He says Levi is 43 when they go down to Egypt. And he says, therefore, if she gave birth another 57 years later, then Levi is 100 when he gives birth to Yocheved. That works, he's still alive, but he's as old as Avram when the miracle happens. And how old is Yocheved when she gives birth in this calculation? Well, it's 57 years after the Yetzias Mitzrayim. So she's therefore, let's do the maths. She will now be 73 when Moshe is born. Because we have the problem that in one generation, we have to cover 130 years. So the first point the Ramban says on the Ibn Ezra is, I don't know what the Ibn Ezra wants. But however you cut the numbers, something strange is going to go on. Either Levi is very old when he gives birth to Yocheved, and Yocheved is a reasonable age when she gives birth to Moshe, or Yocheved is very old when she gives birth to Moshe, and Levi is a reasonable age, or we split the difference, in which case he says there's a double miracle happening over here, because Levi is in his 90s when he gives birth, is 100 when he gives birth to Yocheved, and Yocheved is still 73 when she gives birth to Moshe. So there's no way of avoiding this problem that the numbers mean that they're giving birth at an old age. The final point.
It's not such a problem with if Levi's father the child in his old age as if a woman gave birth.
Well, we still seem to make a fuss about Avram giving birth at 100. In which case, Levi giving birth at 100 is yeah. I mean, you're right. So biologically, it's slightly less remarkable, but still very strange. So we don't have a way of squaring that circle, other than in the Ibn Ezra's assumption that there are miracles that take place that the Torah doesn't mention. So Ramban now makes 2 points over here. His second point is a very important one, but in a way the less interesting one. His second point is he says, my dear Ibn Ezra, I think you misread the whole issue. People used to live in those days. Avram lived till 175. 100, therefore, is middle age, not miraculous at all that he's giving birth. In the lifespan of how people are living, these ages aren't remarkable at all. Sarah gives birth at 90, she lives to 127. It's a little old, she's in her 50s, but not stunning, not super miraculous. Why does the Torah treat this as a miracle? Because this is the first time they've given birth. They were unable to conceive till that point. Evidently something is wrong. We have our theories about what was wrong with Avram, what was wrong with Sarah. There's various chazals about this. But someone who's been married for many decades and then reaches late middle age and gives birth, that's a remarkable miracle. That's a remarkable nace. Someone who just gives birth at middle age after having had a normal life, it's interesting, it's a little unusual, but there's nothing remarkable at all. So this is his second critique on the Ibn Ezra. He says, I think you've misunderstood the nace that's happened. By the way, he points out again, and you don't want to get into a fight in the Ramban, because bit by bit, you just see the precision with which he's unpicking Ibn Ezra's point. He said, by the way, Avram gives birth after the death of Sarah. He marries Keturah, and he has several children. And there's no fuss made about the miracles at all. This is 40 years after the birth of Yitzchak. 40 years. So why is no fuss made about having these children? Big nace that happened. He said, because Avram's giving birth at 140. So again, it's late Middle Ages. For someone who lives to 175, 180, this is slightly older than average, but nothing remarkable at all. He says, my dear Ibn Ezra, you've misunderstood what the miracle. The miracle was never the ages over here. This is simply in proportion to the amount they live, late Middle Age. The nace is that for decades they've been married and nothing has happened, and now in late Middle Age children are born. That's a remarkable miracle. Beyond that, this isn't the nace at all. So Ramban has struck at the Ibn Ezra twice in dismantling his argument. His first point is, why are you picking on Chazal for this miracle of Yocheved giving birth at 130? You have this problem yourself. However you play the numbers, there's a 130-year gap between descending to Egypt and Moshe being born. Second point, the miracles of the birth of Avram and Sarah giving birth was never about age. When you do the numbers, when you crunch the numbers, given lengthier lifespan at the time, these ages are a little unusual, but nothing so remarkable. But then he says this philosophical point, and this is very interesting. And he says that in his view, and this is a view that the Ibn Ezra would have disagreed with, he says, in my view, the whole Torah, it's perfectly reasonable and pshat in the Torah for there to be unmentioned nisim that take place. What makes you bothered by an unmentioned nace? Because it's unusual, it's rare, it's the bizarre, it's the sort of thing you would want the Torah to elaborate on. That's misunderstanding completely the worldview of the Torah. The Torah sees nisim as part of the natural flow of life, as part of the norm. These are regular occurrences that occur. He says the whole Torah is predicated on a nace. Look, when we say that if you keep the mitzvahs, it will rain in the right time, that's miraculous. That's not normal life. Kashrus, breaking the laws of kashrus, eating chaylev, needing to chores. This is a natural event. This is a miraculous event. The whole Torah in the worldview of the Ramban, very different to the worldview, of course, of the Rambam and the Ibn Ezra himself. He says the whole Torah is built on an assumption that it doesn't have to obey the normal laws of nature. He says the whole goals of the Torah and the whole function of the Torah is as oisos and mosim, as spiritual signs. He says the harvest cycle, the choris cycle, the rewards and punishment cycle, this is all built on a supernatural worldview. In other words, we shouldn't read a text where it's somehow strange for a Midrash to bring to our attention a whole miracle that's barely commented on by the Torah or just emerges from the Pshat. This is no contradiction to Pshat. So again, we see the same machlokas we've spoken about before. The Ibn Ezra says an unspoken nace that isn't made a fuss about is a contradiction to Pshat. I accept the Torah can do nisim, says Ibn Ezra. I'm not denying that, but I want bells and whistles around that. I want that a big deal to be made of it. This isn't the sort of text where we could expect a nace just to be casually and flippantly mentioned. Says the Ramban, I completely disagree. If you understand the functioning of the Torah and the worldview of the Torah, the whole of life is nisim, nistorim. It's all hidden miracles, according to the Ramban. We live in a less spiritual world. Perhaps think about my shiur last week about Hanukkah and the changes that are taking place. We live in this sort of scientific, rational world, but that's not how the Torah, that's not the world of the Torah lives. That's not the understanding of the Torah, of the relationship between the Bria and the creation and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when does the Torah make a fuss about Nisim? The rare nace prophetically preordained, prophetically mentioned, where a Novi has predicted it, and where it's being used to make a particular point. So big and elaborate miracles happen with Yetzias Mitzrayim, because this is trying to form a nation's worldview. To understand and recognize that Hashem is in control of everything, and He's running the world, and that there's nevuah and communication from the divine, and so on and so forth. Or there's a particular necessity for this, a particular reason why a fuss needs to be made. But the purpose, as the Ramban says elsewhere, of the big Nisim Galuyim, the big miracles about which a fuss is made, such as Yetzias Mitzrayim, is to teach us that actually we have a distorted worldview. We need to realize that actually miracles are all around us, and the world abounds with miracles if only we notice them. They're just Nistorim, they're a little bit more concealed. So there's a Peshat point that the Ramban is making, predicated on a theological point. Since the Ramban is an opponent of this sort of Maimonidean worldview, in which the argument is that even as a Marmin with a very close, visceral, passionate connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Rambam, as Maimonides was, but the world we live in is a world which is meant to function in line with the laws of nature. The Rambam says that's not at all my picture of how the world is. The Torah's perspective is that Nisim abounds all over the place, and therefore no fuss is made about them. When is a fuss made? When a Novi predicts it, when a nevuah is sent about it, because then if a nevuah is sent about it, that means that this is a targeted message with a particular impact and purpose it's meant to achieve, and that's when a fuss is made about Nisim. So says the Ramban in his response to Ibn Ezra, and what's really therefore going on is I don't see that intruding unspoken about Midrashim should bother you. This is the reason I'm elaborating on this is because, first of all, for those who are interested in theology, this is an important divide and debate, one that we've discussed in other contexts, but also for those interested in Peshat. It yet again brings out this point that depending on how you understand the Torah works will depend on what you can't look at a text and say, what is the Peshat in it? It depends about what the assumptions are of how the text works, what sort of text it is. If you read Shakespeare, the Peshat can be a metaphor. And if you read a technical manual, no way can that be the Peshat. Similarly with the Torah, is it reasonable for there to be a nace barely mentioned, or custom, Avram is thrown into the fire of furnace, alluded to in one word that the Midrash picks up on, I took you out from the Urul, from the furnace, or not? That depends on your worldview of how you understand Nisim. And then finally, the Ramban says that I have another piece of evidence for this. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but he says if we look at the genealogy of David HaMelech, which we know well because, of course, it's listed for us in Megillas Rus, we have Shalman, Boaz, and Ovad, and Yishai. We have 4 generations. And if you work out the number of years between when they entered Eretz Yisrael till the birth of David, it's 270 years, divided amongst 4 generations. Therefore, on average, childbirth is taking place at 93. And again, no particular fuss made about that in the Torah. So you see that if you're going to go with the line of the Ibn Ezra, that this is an incredible old age, then you see the Torah is happy not to mention it. Alternatively, evidently, given extended lifespans, this isn't as miraculous as Ibn Ezra seems to think. So this is the Ramban's approach to the topic. he thinks this is a pshat, a very clear and simple pshat in Pesukim. The fact that Nisim miracles are taking place is assuming miracles is pshat. This isn't a Midrash putting something into the Pesukim. It's a perfectly legitimate way of reading the verses. So says the Ramban in his comments on the Ibn Ezra. Let's now try and pause for a few moments and understand in this remarkable reading the idea behind the birth of the idea of Yocheved being born Bein HaChomes. And actually, before we do that, maybe I'll go out of order and we'll have a look at the Midrash that I printed in source 6. Yeah, I know I numbered my sources correctly. A Midrash that I printed in source 6. At the bottom of page, the middle of page 4 in the handout. Now, when we learn Rashi, we often don't see Rashi's answer in the full range and context of the answers that can be given. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn a little bit of Midrash now and see the answers that the Midrash gives, and then try and understand, perhaps in a deeper level, what the Midrash is trying to achieve over here with this idea of Yocheved being born between the walls. Because in truth, whether we understand the Midrash literally or whether we understand the Midrash metaphorically, it's telling us something. It's not a coincidence that Yocheved is born between the walls. There's a message in this. Why would it be that the Ramban says that assuming a miracle occurring is not something that should bother us? But what should bother us is why is it that you have this situation where there's only 69 names mentioned? Yocheved can't be mentioned in the list because she's not yet born as they go down to Egypt. On the other hand, she should be mentioned in the list because as they enter into Egypt, she's born, and she's born exactly on the intersection, exactly on the border. By the way, because these are both border events, it can occur like that. While they're outside Egypt, she's not yet born. While when they're inside Egypt, she is born. And the moment of crossing over the border, geographically, is the moment of crossing over the border in her life. But what does that mean? What's going on over here? Whether the Midrash means this literally or metaphorically, what's the message that the Midrash is trying to tell us? So let's have a look at the Midrash inside and see a sequence of answers. So this is source 6 in the Midrash Rabbah. Etc. Rabbi Levi b'shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman. By the way, this is a trimmed down Midrash. The Midrash has about another 4 or 5 comments, which I removed just for the sake of simplicity. Rabbi Levi, this is a Midrash Rabbah, so it can be found online quite easily and worth having a look at. Rabbi Levi b'shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman. Have you ever in your life seen such a phenomena that someone gives to their friend 66 cups, and then he gives him a further 6, and he counts them as 70? So I'm not exactly sure what the sort of mashal or parable or metaphor that the Midrash is using is meant to indicate. The Midrash seems to indicate that if you give someone 69 cups, you can round them up to 70. If you give someone 66 and 3, you wouldn't round them up to 70. That's something like that is what he's saying. But this is Yocheved. She finished off she completed the number of Jews in Egypt. Rabbi Levi b'shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman omas. That's answer number 1. Yocheved ibura ba'eretz Canaan v'leidas of Eretz Mitzrayim. She was conceived, or her pregnancy occurred in the land of Canaan, and her birth occurred in the land of Egypt. And this is the pasuk. Actually, we'll miss out the next one. So let's go into the next source. Shemesh Avinu Yaakov mitosei. Yaakov Avinu has already conceived. Yocheved had already been conceived in Egypt. And nonetheless, Hashem calls her nefashos. This is a pasuk from Bilam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu counts even those who are conceived and not yet born in the number of Yisrael. So this Midrash is giving a different answer to the question. It says, you know where Yocheved is when they go down to Egypt? She's conceived, but not yet born. And that's why she counts as a number, but not a name. She doesn't yet have a name because she's not yet born, but she counts as a number because Hashem counts of the population of the Jewish people, even those who are as yet unborn. Again, very, very interesting Midrash, sets us thinking all sorts of ideas, what it means to be a human being, the status of a fetus. But this is what the Midrash says, that Hashem counts in the number of the Bnei Yisrael, even an unborn fetus. And this is a second answer to our question. So this is answer number 2.
There's only one unborn fetus amongst that whole group, which
Correct, and that's the assumption that we're making. Yes, there's the only one. There's a lot, by the way, about this whole numbering system that needs to be understood. I mean, maybe we'll see something about this later. But there's a discrepancy here between the male and female population, which is also interesting. No, so the only daughter mentioned is Serach. By the way, I didn't point this out, but in Pasuk Tesvav, Pasuk 15, where we have the number problem, it says Kol Nefesh Bonov U'Benosov Shloshim Shalish. The names of his sons and daughters is 33. Now we've listed 31 sons, one daughter. So who are his daughters? So one answer would be this Midrash that says Yocheved is the unnamed daughter. That would be, by the way, another shut advantage of this Midrash, that these are the daughters of Yaakov that are listed. But Rashi's already bothered by this question. I mean, statistically, out of 70 descendants, the odds of there being one or two daughters is very low. If someone has a family of 5 or 7, that could be statistically, but out of 70, it's vanishingly unlikely. The wives aren't mentioned in the list. Fine, these are descendants, not descendants-in-law. But are there no other sisters over here? Again, who knows? The Ramban wouldn't be bothered by this question. This is already addressed by the Midrashim earlier, and the Midrashim say that the others would have had a problem had they had daughters, because in those days, wives were brought into their parents-in-law family. So a daughter who was born was going to face a difficult role. Would she remain unmarried? And if she does get married, who's she going to marry? An Oved Avod Zarah, she'll leave the Jewish people. And therefore, it's not an unmitigated blessing in that generation to have daughters until the population begins expanding and growing. So there's various midrashim that deal with this issue. We've discussed this in the past on the pasuk of Hashem Berachas Avram Bakol. Avram was blessed with everything. Does that mean he had a bracha that he had a daughter, or that he didn't have a daughter because it would have raised problems for him? I mean, one of the themes of the Dinos story and so on is that having a daughter in a hostile world is not such a simple business. So the Midrashic answer would be, at least according to this position in Chazal, that Hashem Berachas Avram B'Kolin, that he didn't have a daughter, is that indeed Yaakov didn't have daughters, because at that stage in their career, while they were still one family of siblings, there were to be no marital opportunities other than leaving the fold of Bnei Israel, of the Jewish people. The next generation, you've already got cousins, and then daughters can be born, and Klal Yisrael can flourish. So these are Midrashic answers. Rashi brings an alternative Midrashic answer that there were daughters. These were ta'omos, and that the Shvatim married half siblings. It ties into our discussion about to what degree they kept mitzvahs, the Shvatim. But Rashi brings such a Midrashic opinion that they married half siblings, in which case we'd have to explain why they're not listed, and Rashi raises this question. So there are a number of difficulties around this point. But either way, the Midrash's second answer is that Yocheved is the single soul, the only soul in the list who is in this mid-territory. She's conceived, she's there, present, but not yet named because she isn't yet born, and nonetheless she counts in the number of the Jewish people. The next Midrash, VaYigash, Yaakov Hishlim Imoyna Saminyan. Yaakov adds up, he counts as the number in the counts. That's where we get to 70. The next Midrash, by the way, and that's the pshat that Ibn Ezra adopted, right? So it's a Midrash, but this is the pshat Ibn Ezra adopted, that the 70th soul is Yaakov. The next Midrash answer, Hashem counts as the number. Very interesting idea. There's 69 souls plus Hashem counting as the number. Hashem counts as the number, again, needs a lot of thought. A difficult Midrash to read. Chushim, the son of Don, he adds up the number to the 70. What does it mean that Chushim ben Don adds up to the 70? So if we look in our psukim, I hope I printed this. Yes, I did. Pasuk Kaf Gimel, Pasuk 23 on page 1. Ubnei Don Chushim, the sons of Don are Chushim. Now we normally think there's one figure called Chushim. Chushim sounds a bit like a plural word. So did Don have two children called Chush or Chushim, who are known as Chushim, or B'nai Don Chushim? Don had two children counted as Chushim. It's a difficult Midrashic answer because it resolves the 70 number, but doesn't resolve the 33 number in the B'nai Leah. The Ibn Ezra, by the way, discusses this B'nai Don Chushim, and he says either it's a turn of phrase, that since all the families have a plural So this is also listed as a plural, even though Don only had one child, Chushim. Or he says maybe Don had two children called Chushim, of whom only one survived. So he had a child, he named the child Chushim, that child died, and then he had the second son who he named after his first child, and therefore called him Chushim also. And therefore B'nai Don, the children of Don, were known as Chushim, even though in the number count, only one of them counts. Because if we look in Pasuk 25, B'nai Bilhah are listed as 7 children, in which case Chushim isn't counted as 2, that's only counted as 1. Again, very, very interesting Midrash. What's the Midrash doing? Co-joined twins, yeah. And then we get to the final Midrashic answer. Maybe Serach, the daughter of Asher, is the one who adds up to the minyan. Again, a very difficult Midrash because Serach is found in the list of, already listed as Serach Asher amongst 70. Okay, so why am I bringing the Midrash at this point with, I think if we kept track, 8 answers, no, 6 answers that we read in the fuller Midrash, there's another few answers, but 6 answers to the question as to how the number count works. Why am I reading the Midrash now? I'm trying to indicate that there's a variety of answers that can be given, and we need to think midrashically about what the Midrashim are trying to convey with all of these. What's it trying to say in this idea? What's the Midrash getting to? When in the reading of the Ibn Ezra, maybe we can have an answer 69, but it's rounded up to 70, but the Ibn Ezra doesn't like that because he says it doesn't resolve the 32, 33. Maybe this is a style of the Pesukim to round up the numbers, and various other sorts of Peshat based answers that can be given as or that Yaakov is counted in the number and so on and so forth. When the Midrash the Midrash wants to understand intrinsically, fundamentally what's going on. What's the message over here? Why does the Torah structure itself so that we have this problem in the text and that we don't know how to resolve it? And what's the message that's being given over here? So I wanted to share a number of Midrashic perspectives for this. And the first one is from the Yaros Dvash. I don't think we've ever learned before the Yaros Dvash in our setting. I printed it on page 3. The Yaros Dvash is a work of Drush, written by the famed Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz, unfortunately, he's well known to us because of the controversy in which he was caught up with Yaakov Emden, but he was an exceptionally important figure in the Masorah of Torah. He was the Zakan HaRosh Yeshivas. He was really the elder of the Doyen of Rosh Yeshivas in his generation. Most of the next generation of Talmidei Chachamim were his students. Very, very important halachic figure, and also a Baal Drush. He was a darshan. And he has a very beautiful piece of drush on these psukim. And his basic point is that first of all, the number 70 is a significant number. It's not a coincidental number. We find, for example, there's 70 ummahs, 70 nations in the world. 70 is a number that ought to ring in our ear. There's a certain sense of completion around 70. It's the size of a unit. It's 7 times 10, with 7 is the days of the week and the course of nature, and 10 is the completion and the fullest expression of these. He says we need to be alert to when the Torah is using significant numbers. By the way, there often are significant numbers in the Torah. So 40 is a number that reverberates throughout the Torah. 40 is, in the language of Chazal, 40 is the number of days from when a child is conceived till when you first have a fetus in its smallest form inside a mother. It's the beginning of something coming into existence. And many examples of things coming into existence take 40. Klal Yisrael embedded in the womb of the Midbar for 40 years. Moshe is on Har Sinai for 40 days, being transformed from a human being into a makabel Torah, into the recipients of Torah. In the Mabul, there's the transformation of the world that takes place, but there's reigning of 40 days. So 40 is a significant number. We need to be alert to the sorts of numbers that feature again and again in the Torah. And he says that 70 is a significant number over here. And he goes into, I printed actually twice, 2 parts of his explanation. Again, in the interest of time, we're not going to read all of this inside. But he says that in different formulations, he says the following idea. He says Yocheved needs to be born bein hachomis. That's exactly the spot that she needs to be born in, because Klal Yisrael have to come into existence in Mitzrayim, but they can't come into existence immersed and embedded in Mitzrayim. They need to already come into Egypt as a unit. We're talking here about the transition from a family into a people, into the smallest possible people. Where do they need to become a people? In Mitzrayim. That's the place that they need to become a people. However, if they enter into Mitzrayim not as a people, without the Hashra Sashchina, then they're vulnerable to Egypt. How can they go into Mitzrayim like that? In Eretz Yisrael, they can exist as 69 individuals who haven't yet formed this unit of peoplehood, and they can still have Hashra Sashchina. They can still have HaKadosh Baruch amongst them. They enter into Egypt and they only have 69, they're vulnerable. They're a family entering into a nation and they're going to be swallowed up. But on the other hand, the essence of Yetzias Mitzrayim is Goy Mekarev Goy, a nation being born. Klal Yisrael needs to be born as a people in Egypt. Why do we need to be born as a people in Egypt? Remember our Pesach discussions. The founding story of what it means to be a Jew is to be in Golus, is to be an ex-slave, is to be vulnerable. So we have a problem over here. We need to enter into Mitzrayim as a unit, as 70, with the Hashras Hashchina, the divine presence of peoplehood on us. And on the other hand, we need to, and we need to be resilient in so doing. We need to have 70 souls paralleling the 70 nations of the world, so that we have within us all the spiritual potentiality to lift all the 70 nations of the world and eventually bring it back to its perfection, as is our task as Jews. But we need to enter into Mitzrayim already as a unit, and yet we need to be born in Mitzrayim as a people. And therefore, Yocheved being born at that point of the border is exactly the precise point that she needs to be born. We need to go into Mitzrayim and leave Eretz Yisrael as 69 individuals. We need to enter Mitzrayim as 70 who have become one unit and are no longer individuals, but are a people. So says the Yaris Tavash in a beautiful reading of this Midrash. So again, he says 70 nations. Klal Yisrael need to embody these 70 nations. We need to have within us, our nationhood is built on the ability to bring revelation to all 70 nations, to carry within us the spiritual potency of all these 70 nations. We need to be a unit, we need to be a miniature people as we enter into Egypt, on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have to be born in Mitzrayim. That's where we need to come into existence as a nation. How do we resolve that paradox? By leaving Eretz Yisrael as 69, by entering Mitzrayim as 70. So this is the first point that the Yaris Tavash mentions. The second point that he mentions, which gets us into more mystical territory, and I'm not going to go into, is he says it's not coincidence that this is a female, a girl, who's born at this point, rather than a male. And he says that Klal Yisrael needs both combinations. Different nations have different spiritual forces and different potencies to them. Mitzrayim is the appropriate culture for her as a girl to be born into. It may be only once they become a people of 70 is it safe for her to have been born as a girl. As we discussed, a girl born into a family is not such a simple proposition in the generation of us. They're only ready for a girl to be born. She's the first Jewish girl born into a people, into Klal Yisrael. She's the mother of Klal Yisrael. She's the first girl born as part of once the Jewish people are no longer a family, but we are now Bnei Yisrael, and therefore it's appropriate for her to be born as a girl into Mitzrayim. So says the Yaris Tavash. And I think this leads us to a chain of thoughts about how to understand these Midrashim and what sense to make of them. Because it seems to me that the Midrash, all these different Midrashim are really grappling with the same issue, which is, what does it mean to descend into Golus? And how do we deal with descent into Golus? And who is this missing 70th figure, this mysterious 70th figure, who somehow is accompanying them and allowing them to descend into Golus? So the Yaris Tavash has given this very beautiful explanation that there needs to be a 70th that accompany him. But the Midrash is exploring a range of options of how to build this. Who is this extra figure that's needed?
One idea is, as it said, is Hashem.
One idea is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, absolutely. One reasonable explanation of this idea is, when Klal Yisrael descends into Golus, who do they need to go with them? The mystery 70th guest that goes with them has to be HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is built really on a pasuk. And Yaakov is depressed as he's going down to Mitzrayim. He realizes this is going to be a long and bitter sojourn. He's nervous. Read the psukim of after Yosef sends his message, come down to Mitzrayim. We pick up the visceral hesitancy. Yaakov is very hesitant about whether he should go down to Mitzrayim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears to him. And what does Hashem say to him? Don't be afraid of going down to Egypt. I'll make you into a great nation there. That's what we just said. Where do we become a nation? In Mitzrayim. That's where we need to become a nation. I will descend with you down to Egypt, and I will also surely come up with you. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying to Yaakov, I'm going to go down to Egypt with you, and I'm going to come up from Egypt with you. Therefore, the mysterious 70 figure is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the hidden member of the party who isn't mentioned in order to accompany as per the Midrash. And this is the famous idea, of course, of Shechina B'Galusa, that when we're in Galus, HaKadosh Baruch Hu somehow is also present with us in these difficult times.
Before they entered Mitzrayim, there was a lot of infighting between the different factions.
Yes.
As they're entering Mitzrayim, really is the time that they do come together.
They're coalescing.
That infighting stops. They've become that nation, and in a way, you can think that's where Hashem would want to be part of that group.
Yeah.
In a way that wasn't quite so comfortable before.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You are right. I mean, we don't find these tensions afterwards. We find the brothers afraid of how Yosef is going to react, and Yosef reassuring them. But if you like, this is a point where they make the transition from being brothers to being Shabbatim. They're now tribes. They're not just brothers. They're moving and making that transition from being a family to being a people. Then the Midrash suggests that maybe this extra figure is Chushim ben Don. Again, we don't know much about Chushim, but we know what he is in the Midrashic reading the Pesukim. Chushim is the one who, when they go to bury Yaakov in Maras Machpelah, and Esau is delaying them, he takes out his sword. Chushim in the Midrash is deaf, he can't hear. He's somehow immune from the influences around him. He's got this figure, this midah of just doing that which is right because it's right, without hesitation, without complexity, without nuance, without hesitation. So Chushim maybe is the extra figure that's accompanying them. Chushim has a dual personality. He's not just an individual, but he equips them with the barrier that they need around them, almost the metaphorical deafness that they need around them in thought of the Midrash, in order to be able to descend to Mitzrayim. And then we have Serach as the suggestion of the Midrash. Serach is, in the Midrashic thinking, the woman who never dies. She accompanies Klal Yisrael throughout the history. In other words, in this reading, she is the one who's giving Yaakov the message. You're going down to Mitzrayim, you're nervous, but this is all part of a long story. This is part of a pattern of history. The Midrash links Serach to the tradition of Pakod Pakadati, when Hashem says to, at the end of Sefer of Bereshis, don't worry, Pakod Pakadati, I'm going to revisit you. And the Midrash sees this as almost a code word that the future redeemer of Klal Yisrael will have to deliver. It's Serach who's the one who remembers this as the code word that's been given and communicates that now to Klal Yisrael and ensures the continuity of God's. So it seems the Midrash in all its answers is trying to resolve this idea of who is the extra figure who's going down and take it with it. And with that, I want to revisit the message and the metaphor of Yocheved born between the walls. Because both on a pshat level and on a more profound level, I think there's something powerful going on over here. Yaakov is nervous. He's going down to Egypt. As he enters Egypt, a new child is born. As he enters Egypt, they're given the hope of there's a continuity here. Things are carrying on. Klal Yisrael are carrying on. There's a continuation of your family. And in the reading of the Yaris Devash, this isn't any child born. This is a child who completes you and makes you into a nation. But it's more than that. Yocheved is the mother of Moshe. The Midrash is telling us that at the moment they're descending into Golus, the future Goyel, the future Redeemer, is born. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is makdim refuah l'makom. He puts the cure before the blow. You're entering into Mitzrayim. As you're entering into Mitzrayim, the future Redeemer of Klal Yisrael's mother is born. She's the midwife, the person who brings the next generation into existence. According to the Midrash, Shifra and Puah are Yocheved and Miriam. And finally, she's an important link in the chain because she's Yocheved who is born outside Mitzrayim. She isn't born in Mitzrayim. She's born on the border. But she's also not born in Eretz Yisrael. She's the first of the new generation of a new type of Jew who hasn't lived in Eretz Yisrael, who hasn't seen Avraham and Yitzchak, who hasn't lived the supernatural life of Eretz Yisrael, where prophecy abounds, where Klal Yisrael are independent. She's the bridge figure between these two generations. The pre-generation, the generation that are coming down to Egypt, are the 70 souls, according to the scene. They're the ones that remember Eretz Yisrael. They remember the life beforehand. There's going to be a new generation born who are going to be born in Egypt, who are only going to know the life of Shibud, of Golus, of repression, of slavery. Who's going to speak to who? How are they going to communicate these two generations? There needs to be a bridging figure who knows and remembers what Eretz Yisrael is, but can also relate and understand what it means to be born in Egypt. And this is the figure of Yocheved. Vayastem bottom, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is the midwife who is able to bring the next generation of children into existence in Egypt. Who can be a midwife? Who can be the bridge that communicates between generations? Only a Yocheved, who's born between the walls. Only a Yocheved, who on the one hand remembers and is a product of the world of Eretz Yisrael, and on the other hand, is a product of Mitzrayim. Someone who's pure Israeli, pure Eretz Israel, pure born in Eretz Israel, can't speak to a child who's pure Mitzri. A pure Mitzri can't bring the hope and the vision of Eretz Israel. Yocheved is the one who can be the midwife, who can act as the bridge between the two generations. She's the first of this new breed of Klal Yisrael born, but also the last of the old breed. She's someone born not in Egypt, but also not born in Eretz Israel. She's born on the borders. And it seems to me that this is, when we look at the range of answers in the Midrash, we understand a little bit better what the Midrash is trying to resolve in understanding who this mysterious number 70 is. So I'll stop there for this evening. And I hope that gives a little bit of insight into a difficult Rashi and Midrash. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Zobin. It's excellent.
Thank you so much. Thank you as always.
Sure, thank you.